Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm going to just speak from here because it's easier to point to slides. But if I feel a bit too remote from you, or you feel a bit too distant from me, I will move to the front and I'll give Cornelia another headache. So hopefully it will be a constructive headache. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The whole question of evolution and the powers latent in man devolves on the inquiry into what is consciousness and what is intelligence. Is it primordial and the primary in us, or is consciousness and intelligence an epiphenomenon or a byproduct of some material process in nature? And our whole session this afternoon is really designed around this central inquiry. So is it possible for us to establish whether mind and consciousness, let alone the mind of a genius, are the fortuitous concurrence of just the right amount of DNA fired by the right amount of genes, or the other way around, or whether there are deeper issues at stake? And at the moment, the hot debate in science is indeed between Darwinism and creationism. But there is a third factor, which is completely ignored by them, of course, which is the tremendous occult doctrine of evolution and Anthropogenesis. It is an absolutely stupendous doctrine, but I think in order to understand the occult doctrine, we have to understand the scientific position first, in order to see why it is incomplete, and also in order to state the case for the occult doctrines when we talk to our scientific friends. We've got to know both sides. So I'm going to deal with the scientific part first, and just dip the scientific in the occult, and then in part two we are going to be marinated in the occult, if I can put it that way. So let me start by putting up what I always have in front of me on my desk at home. I have three quotations, one from Beethoven, one from Blavatsky, and one from Paul Brunton. And the Brunton one says this: well, we're talking of that's evolution going backwards. We're talking about evolution and its interface with the esoteric doctrine in part one, but we always make the point that the truth needed for intermediate and provisional use may be gleaned from books and teachers and lectures and all of that, but the truth of the ultimate revelation is always attained from and within oneself by meditation. HPB said that, the Buddha said that, Krishnamurti said that. How many more people do we need to point this out to us? So, by way of contents, and I do have a handout, so, by the way, we might prove natural selection, you know. If people at the back can't see, then eyes by natural selection must develop powers of greater clairvoyance, so you can read rather poor slides. So if that doesn't happen, we've proven Darwin to be wrong. So the scientific and Darwinian model, its theory, its limitations, and its bridges towards the occult. The first one is the scientific picture on evolution and consciousness. Don't worry about the small print, because all of this is part of a raw book that I've produced, and I think I gave it to you, Cornelia, so copies are available. In part two of the first session, we have bridges from the scientific to the esoteric, and then finally we shatter the backbone of Darwinian theory by the work of Richard Milton and Kramer and Thompson. So let's now talk about the scientific picture on evolution and consciousness. Always two parts. First, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Is natural selection, which is evolution directed by adaptive fitness. In other words, external influences, nature as opposed to nurture. So natural selection in biology refers to the process by which environmental influences will dictate varying degrees of reproductive success amongst individuals in a population of organisms with different hereditary traits. Alright? So those traits that inhibit reproductory success will decrease in frequency from generation to generation, and hence the resulting increase in the proportion of reproductively successful individuals will tend to enhance the adaptation of the population to its environment. And it is these favourable natural variations, however slight, that is known as the process of natural selection. Now, Darwin said in his Origin of the Species, can we doubt, remembering that many more individuals are born than can possibly survive, however slight over others would have the best chance of surviving and of procreating their kind? This is in his famous book, The Origin of the Species. On the other hand, we may be sure that any variation in the least degree injurious would be rigidly destroyed. This preservation of favourable variations and the rejection of injurious variations I call natural selection. And applied as an example to the most basic of survival instincts, the need for food, natural selection states that the food supply problem, in that the young born to any species must compete severely for food, and these young survive to produce the next generation. Therefore, each generation will, by natural selection, improve adaptively over preceding generations, and the mechanism behind this evolution is this gradual and continuous improvement process over time. And the environment, therefore, exerts a very powerful influence. And Darwin argued that all related organisms are descended from a common ancestry. This was a refinement of the idea of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who reasoned that the pattern of resemblance that's found in creatures through evolution are modifications of a common lineage, So, for example, the domestic animals like the cats have and the wild tigers have evolved from a common sort of tiger family, and other animals have all descended from a common ancestral lineage. So, according to Darwin's principle of evolution, natural selection of well-adapted individuals spans many, many generations. Now, if you look at this statement, how would a scientist or an occultist be regarded if he said things like, we may be sure that can possibly have the greatest advantage? Can we doubt? These are all subjective statements. Can we doubt? We must be sure that. In fact, the whole of The Origin of the Species is full of these sort of emotional appeals. We can be sure that. How can you possibly doubt me? It is obvious that, but it is not so obvious. A scientist or an occultist making these sort of subjective statements would be jeered out of court. But somehow, Darwin is let loose, and this is only because of the enormous influence that he has had. So, natural selection, the external environment exerts a powerful influence. It is nature rather than nurture. Now enter genetics, evolution directed by random favourable mutation, internal factors, nurture as against nature. So Gregor Mendel, and I think Michael, is he there? He mentioned that Mendel was not mentioned in by the masters actually, and Mendel discovered that heritability of traits or characteristics are transmitted across generations in discrete units known as genes, and the gene is the biological equivalent of the quantum in physics. The quantum is a discrete energy unit where Planck discovered energy does not flow in continuous lines but in discrete quantities that he called the quantum. Similarly, the gene is the biological equivalent of the quantum. And he discovered that inheritable changes in genes, are called mutations, could occur spontaneously and randomly without regard to the environment. So with a stable population, the gene frequency remains the same, even though genes may be recombined in different ways in each individual. However, evolution is signaled by a sustained change in the gene frequency in the gene pool. And the science of genetics, of course, underwent a dramatic change in 1953 when Watson and Crick demonstrated how genetic material is composed of DNA and RNA, deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. And actually Francis Crick, who got the Nobel Prize and who is the darling god of science, you see his name mentioned all the time, Crick actually wrote a letter to Sir Winston Churchill when the Cambridge College in Churchill was being inaugurated under Sir Winston's name, Churchill College. And he recommended to Sir Winston in writing that it would be better for the college to have a brothel than a chapel. Such was his anti-religious feeling. So, natural selection is the process that maintains or promotes adaptation. It was proposed by Darwin to account for the adaptive organization of living beings, and it works to ensure the survival of the most effective competitors in the competition for limited resources and in their response to a changing environment. So the synthetic theory of evolution, the mechanism behind evolution, is that evolution of species is characterized by genetic changes in its population. And the neo-Darwinian mechanistic synthetic theory states that the driving force has two coupled aspects. Mutations are the accidental changes in the structure of genes, and they are individually unpredictable in any sense because they depend on probabilistic events. And the neo-Darwinian theory says that the driving force, and this is really the summary of it, is hereditary variations. The gene frequency changes are caused by spontaneous mutations, which provides hereditary variations, which then provides the gene pool with a continuous supply of new genes. That's the first thing. And then natural selection directs that the gene frequencies change so that favorable, advantageous genes occur in increasing proportions. So you have genetic changes, spontaneous random mutations of the genes, and then natural selection determines which genes will most favorably adapt to the environment. This is the current textbook account of evolution, because we're told the range of genetic, ecological and systematic evidence supposedly shows that this theory can be supported by experiment and observation. But natural selection is not the only source of genetic change, and some scientists have postulated and demonstrated a 26 million year periodicity. For example, the cycle of extinctions over the past 250 million years can be broken down into a 26 million year cycle. So steps in the evolution and emergence of major life forms is this. 3.5 billion years ago, life on Earth originated. 700 million years ago, multicellular plants. 650 million years ago, basic body plants and modern animals. 400 million land plants, 360 million years, the invertebrate animals. 135 million, the dinosaurs. 65 million years ago, dramatic changes occurred, rendering the dinosaurs extinct. And only 5 to 6 million years ago, the common origin of apes and hominidae took place on the African continent. Because natural selection occurs from primitive life forms to man according to geological epoch and time, because of the variability of the environment, different modes of life are required in different habitats. Right? So burrowing, swimming, walking, flying are some of the locomotive solutions to life in these environments. And the key to the development of these structures is that the necessary innovations must first have occurred as an adaptation to some aspect of an ancestral mode of life, and then proved useful in the new mode of life. So, for example, the limbs required for terrestrial walking were the adaptations were evolved from the fins of fish, stiffened by having to move out of the water onto land, where obviously the force of gravity is greater. You know, if you swim in the water, you have to exert less pressure on your fins. So by this reckoning, surely the limbs of legendary virtuosos like Paganini and Liszt and Chopin must have evolved from the fins of stiffened fins of fish. Well, I'll leave that with you. But why is it that these wonderful virtuosi appeared in such prolific numbers in that short-lived golden era of the 17th to the 19th century, and so many of them were contemporaries of Blavatsky? How come all these stiffened fins of fish appeared during that short period of the golden age of virtuosity? So on a sort of timeline, I've just drawn it up on a timeline, ranging from 3.5 billion years, organic amino acid molecules, right up to the present epoch, 5.5 million years ago, the anthropoid apes. To summarize, Neo-Darwinian theory states that mutations provide the gene pool with a fresh supply of genes. Natural selection alters the gene frequency so as to preserve advantageous genes. That is all. The rest is just hoo-ha and a variation on those two driving mechanisms. Now, human beings, according to biological science, fall within the zoological family Hominidae, and evidence for the evolution of Hominidae comes from three sources: human paleontology, the study of fossils; primatology, the behavior and the biological study of non-human primates, and paleoanthropology, which is the investigation into the behavior and biological evolution of hominidae. The origin of hominidae, of which Homo sapiens is one order, one class of, is still of considerable speculation. But the received wisdom is that because of the close affinity and resemblance of hominidae to the African great apes, it leads to the inference of a common origin of apes and hominidae that took place on the African continent some 5 to 6 million years ago. Now, the anthropoid apes are regarded as man-like in their anatomical structure. Such examples of anatomic and physiological similarities, plus similarities in blood groups, in diseases, in parasitic infection, in immunological responses, lead science therefore to infer a close similarity, a close phylogenesis, a close evolutionary development between the large apes and hominidae. Note carefully that all these similarities between man and ape are only to do with physical characteristics. They have not touched on, they are not interested in mind and in consciousness. The similarities are just physical. So of course, the destiny of man according to science, science has nothing to say about purpose, and man is a passive reaction to chance, genetic change and environmental pressures. And the fact that such chance can be statistically predicted or experimentally reproduced affords no ultimate stamp of authority. There is no place in biology for free will and evolution guided by destiny. And since these factors cannot be forced into the scientific model, they are just conveniently ignored. So having in a very rudimentary and cursory way sketched the scientific position, we are fully entitled to state our misgivings about the scientific position. What are our misgivings on the orthodox position on evolution? We are terribly uncomfortable with these sorts of issues. Who are the mechanicians? With all this emphasis placed on mechanism, we are entitled to ask, who are the mechanics or the mechanicians behind the mechanics? If science declares that the organization of the immense variety of inorganic and organic compounds in nature all can be explained by chance or accident, and it's governed by statistical law, that statistical law itself cannot be explained. Surely purpose comes before function. If natural selection is supposed to explain why individual species have features such as wings and eyes, and long-distance eyes to look at small PowerPoint slides, then clearly structure serves a specific function. Then to what purpose is this specific function? How can one have a function without knowing its ultimate purpose? And few words are more utterly irritating to scientists than words like purpose. Random and chance are used to circumvent the issue. Then, if nucleic acid, why DNA and RNA? Well, why not sulfuric acid and sodium hydroxide? What's so special about DNA and RNA? Why just protein molecules? What's behind it? If nucleic acids guide the synthesis of protein, why not some other organic compound? Now, Richard Milton, in his book Exploding the Myth of Darwinism, deals with this in considerable detail. But when a species becomes adapted to a new environment, who is the adaptor? Adapting is all very well. Who is the adaptor? Then, if there is a periodicity to mass extinction, what are the deeper implications of it? If novel body structures were developed for walking and flying, for example, who is the structural engineer behind the scenes? How does he decide which form of locomotion best suits the environment? If biological mechanisms are just like complicated pieces of machinery, then why is it that the biological machinery can regenerate itself after arbitrary damage, whereas if, for example, the hard disk on your computer is shattered, it certainly doesn't regenerate itself. It needs the input of a higher intelligence. Your IT engineer, and IT engineers are more intelligent than their computers, despite any evidence to the contrary. So if natural selection is a gradual process, how does it account for the sudden appearances of genius in a short time span? Now this is most important. The foundational premise of biology is the similarity in genes of the human with the gorilla and the chimpanzee. They differ by about 1 or 2%. If so, why is it that there is a vast difference in mentality between the brightest ape and the dullest human being? Take the cleverest monkey, you can find him, take the dullest human being, and there's a vast difference in mentality. Why such a colossal range in intelligence between the dullest human being and the brightest human being? I mean, you take your Mozart and Newton and Leibniz and draw a graph right down to the dullest human being. The range is vast. Why don't we find such a vast range of intelligence, if you can call it that, between the cleverest ape and the dullest ape? They all seem to display the same sort of mentality. So does similarity of physical genetic material automatically imply a similarity of mind? Does it? Obviously not, unless the mind is regarded as a byproduct of physical process. If ape-man genetic similarity proves man came from the monkeys, surely we can just turn it the other way around and prove that monkeys came from men. There is no logic in saying big similarity means the process is just one way. In fact, why is then such hard evidence from Milton and Cremo that shatters the Darwinian assumptions? Why is it rejected? Because Darwinian theory is now really a pretty impregnable fortress. Now, I mentioned Forbidden Archaeology, which is a condensed version of The Hidden History of the Human Race by Cremo and Thompson, and it's a landmark achievement of the late 20th century regarding paleontology, anthropology, and general evolutionary theory. And their principal finding and thesis is that the evolutionary model of human prehistory, painstakingly built up by academics and scholars over the past 2 centuries, is hopelessly in error and has to be completely jettisoned in its entirety. Now, the selfish gene theory has been taken to farcical extremes by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene. On the one hand, he regards organisms, including humans, as throwaway mechanical survival machines, I quote. Yet on the other hand, inconsistently, his selfish genes are anything but mechanistic, for they have been endowed, do not tell who by, with mysterious powers, I quote, to mold matter, to create form, to choose, and even to engage, I quote, in evolutionary arms race and aspire to immortality. They are also supposed to behave, I quote, like Chicago gangsters. So presumably the one power these genes do not have is the power to be unselfish. And then to account for cultural inheritance, Dawkins has coined a new term, memes, which he compares to the selfish genes. And just as examples of memes are tunes, ideas, catchphrases, clothes, fashions, examples of making pots and pans, costumes, and just as the genes propagate themselves in the gene pool by jumping from body to body via the sperm and the egg, so memes propagate themselves by leaping from brain to brain by imitation. So one is then entitled to ask, from whose brains pioneering geniuses like Newton and Beethoven obtained their memes by imitation? Who were they imitating? Well, Dawkins certainly imitates Darwin, but who are the great geniuses imitating? You can see how desperately and how shallow the mechanistic argument is, and how they will grapple at anything to maintain their position. Now, talking of organisms, I always remember listening to a lecture on biology when I was at university by a visiting professor, and whenever he had to say the word organism, he pointed to his colleague and asked him to say the word for him, because he once made a faux pas. You get it?
Yes.
So, how does orthodox science, now moving on, deal with the whole question of brain and consciousness? And we can move through this quite swiftly. The narrow and purely biological mechanistic view, and we have the more enlightened views of quantum theory as a hybrid with the mechanistic. The biological says that the highly transient movement of neurons across the neocortex between 40 and 200 hertz, the cycles per second, that highly transient movement of neurons across the neocortex is the cause of consciousness. And Francis Crick quite openly writes, you, your joys, your sorrows, your loves, your passions, your everything is really the result of this transient activity of neurons. And that is taken to another level by Susan Greenfield, the director of the Royal Institution, in her book, The Private Life of the Brain. Quantum hybrid is an alternative where they try and use quantum theory, and I won't go into the details of it, but I'm sure you know that in quantum theory there is always this relationship between the experiment and the experimenter. In other words, the consciousness, at least in one interpretation, the Copenhagen interpretation, the consciousness of the observer is needed to collapse the wave of probabilities into an actual discrete entity. So we go from probabilities to actualities by virtue of a conscious observer. So in quantum theory, the very act of observation causes a system to collapse from a wave state into a particle state. And this is put forward by Roger Penrose, who worked with Stephen Hawking and Hameroff, and they postulated that the medium of such an orchestration of neurons is the minute fluid-filled microtubules which are present in every cell. So to summarize then, the scientific theory explains evolution as the progress of life forms from the most lowly to man. And the neo-Darwinian mechanistic theory says that innate characteristics are coded or programmed in the DNA by random mutations, which provides the gene pool with a continuous inventory, a supply of new genes, and natural selection, which favors and preserves and multiplies advantageous mutants at the expense of less advantageous ones. So human beings belong to and have evolved from the primates, which is an order of mammals which existed before the dinosaurs became extinct. And science on its own cannot possibly account for the facts of man's destiny or the occurrence of genius, other than ascribing a random chance theory of genetic mutation to it. An evolutionary theory, then, is a model with underlying and unsupportable assumptions. And like models, like all models or maps, it must not be confused with the territory or the reality. And as Blavatsky makes very clear, we must not discard it that natural selection is a part of the overall total process. So we ask then, please science, may we know, if science knows all about the minute chemical ingredients and combinations of genes and chromosomes, etc., why is it that molecular biology cannot just put together these chemicals that it knows so much about, the quantity of it, the quality of it, everything? Why not put it together to manufacture even a midget, let alone a monkey? Now seriously, if we are these chemicals put together, why can't science put these chemicals together in the right proportions, and it knows the right proportions, electron microscope and the mass spectrograph, well that's for the stars, but you know, the MRI and PERT and all of that, put it together and make me a midget. But they can't do that. We ask, why not? And what is it that stands over and above biochemistry? What is it? So then surely we must cross the bridge towards the esoteric. And the two theories put forward as a precursor to the esoteric are the vitalist and the what known as vitalist theories and organicism. And both of these theories argue that evolutionary innovations cannot be explained entirely in terms of chance occurrence, but must invoke some kind of inner organizing principle, a non-mechanistic creative principle, still unrecognized by science. Except one great scientist, Simon Conway Morris, who is professor of paleontology at Cambridge, who in his book Human Beings in a Lonely Universe argues that the whole evolutionary process is directed towards producing man as its goal. So the best of the vitalist theories was provided by the embryologist Hans Driesch, and he used the word entelogy, which means a non-physical, goal-orientated causal factor. A non-physical, goal-orientated causal factor that operates on the physical system but is not part of the physical system. Then organicism brings in the concept of fields, where the wholeness and the goal orientation of these organisms is accounted for in terms of morphogenetic fields. And this is really presages Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphogenesis. And this field is supposed to account for the wholeness of detached parts, which can subsequently grow into new organisms, just like if you cut a bar magnet in half, you have two whole magnets. Both of them have their own field. So entelechy is an inner goal-orientated, non-physical causal factor guiding an organism towards its evolutionary goal. It remains a whole even if the physical organism is damaged. One of the most garish examples of that was given to us by Rupert Sheldrake, that the Russian, I think he was Russian, Lashevitz, he sliced out bits of a dog's brain and found that the dog could still, after a period of recovery of course, remember what he ate and certain activities. What diminished as a result of cutting out his brain was the detail and the subtlety of the dog's behavior, but not his overall recall. So this is this organizing field. And then organicism and the notion of fields, the wholeness and goal orientation accounted for by the field, for example the bar magnet. But the dilemmas posed by these theories is this, that there is still an irresolvable duality between the non-physical field, which yet directs the physical mechanism. One cannot be explained in terms of the other, and a similar drawback that the development is guided in space and time by some causative factor which in itself cannot be localized to a particular place and time. And here we think of David Bohm's idea of the pilot wave in quantum physics, the pilot wave which is non-local, meaning everywhere, non-temporal at all times, but it guides the behavior of the particles. Of course, chance, failure of genes, mistakes and mutations, genetic drift, and all of that, to our biologist, is what would be the hand of karma to a theosophist. How does orthodox biological science then account for intelligence? The brain regarded as the sole organ of intelligence. If natural selection is the principle that gives rise to intelligence in man, then that principle itself must be an intelligent principle, and therefore must be imbued with intelligence, because how can intelligence flow from non-intelligence? So what then is intelligence? Nobody denies that the great geniuses possess just the right grade and combination of physical hereditary characteristics. But what is untenable is to declare that such perfect material is all there is to it, and it occurred by a mere chance combination of precisely the right atoms. And that would be like saying that a Stradivarius self-assembled itself without any underlying design by a violin maker, and that it can play tunes with itself without the need of a Paganini. Can Darwinian theory, evolution proceeding by natural selection of well-adapted individuals over many spans of many generations, can it explain the sudden appearance of genius with characteristics centuries ahead of this species at that time, sometimes under the most adverse circumstances of inferior hereditary traits and hostile environment? You can hardly say that so poor Schubert and Beethoven were born into the most sumptuous environmental surroundings. And as a simplistic example, according to natural selection, a large class of mathematics students would gradually over time tend towards a proportion of the class becoming Newtons or Einsteins. But the one and only real Newton and Einstein suddenly appeared on the human stage with no special family or environmental factors to justify their illimitable attitude for mathematics and physics. For example, Newton's father was completely illiterate. He came from a sheep farming stock. And Einstein was called a lazy dog by his own mathematics teacher, and he received a lot of help from students and others while he was developing the general theory. So, to close this part, we have to invoke science not as our enemy, of course, but as our best ally, because we also have some wonderful discoveries from science which are slowly increasing in number, in quantity and quality, and I think it will reach a turning point where materialistic science will have to back down a bit. So here's one example. As moonlight is borrowed sunlight, so the brain light, the light of the brain, is borrowed from the heart. Now I'll explain that. So the heart rules the head. Occult science says there are 7 cavities in the brain that receive impressions from the heart to enable the memory of the heart to be impressed on that of the brain. That's occult science. Now, the latest science of neurocardiology tells us that there is a second brain in the form of a dense cluster of neurons in the heart, and this cluster of neurons has a magnetic field 5,000 times stronger than the magnetic field of the neurons in the brain. And this is hard science. It's the latest science of neurocardiology. So what it's literally telling us is this, that here is the heart, and the heart, the seat of our consciousness. Of course, consciousness is everywhere, but its greatest density, so to speak, its greatest concentration is in the heart. And the heart shines a beam of light, so to speak, on the brain. And the brain really works by virtue of receiving the signal or the carrier wave from the heart. And all these studies on heart transplant patients have shown how the recipient will take on the characteristics of the donor heart. The most garish example was a young girl of 8 who was given the heart of a murdered girl of about 6. And soon after the transplant, she had visions of the man who murdered the donor heart. To such an extent, with such detail, she was able to describe what he looked like, what he wore, the murder weapon, and what he smelled like. To such an extent that he was found and arrested. And then there have been people, of course, who've taken on the dietary habits and the physical habits of the person whose heart they obtained. So here you have science really corroborating what the ancient wisdom has said. And if you go then to the collected writings, you will find these correspondences. I've called it occult neuroanatomy, correspondence between man's principles and the brain anatomy. So desire, kama, is connected with the cerebellum and the lower part of the body with the liver and the stomach. The mind driven by desire is connected or correlates with the corpora quadrigemina. The mind per se, the abstract mind, with the pituitary body, the mind embraced by wisdom with the pineal gland, and the auric egg, the cavity of the skull filled with the kasha. So what occult science affirms, modern science eventually confirms. And as Brunton put it so beautifully, what the ancient sages, going back to my first slide, what they attained by acute reflection and meditation, science now confirms by laborious experimentation. So we therefore maintain that intelligence is not just the outcome of the conglomeration of cerebral matter directed by a fortuitous concurrence of genes fired by just the right coincidental amounts of DNA. The backbone of Darwinian theory is, well, it's not totally shattered, it's cracking. That I've called it, being optimistic, shattering. Not that I have anything against Darwin, it's just the people who have turned Darwin into an iconic god. Literally, it is the same as Master KH. 2/3 of your world's problems is caused by religion. 2/3 of your problems in science are caused by turning someone's theory and hypothesis into a religion with a small r. So, shattering the backbone, I mentioned the work of Richard Milton, who has no religious beliefs, and he critically examined the evidence at the Natural History Museum, and he found that Darwin's idea of gradual change was refuted by the complete absence of transitional fossils, and worst of all, he found a circular argument or a circular methodology where fossils are used to date the rocks, and the rocks are used to date the fossils. So you have this circularity. And he found many scientists who realized flaws in this theory, but like seeing the emperor without clothes, they dare not shout, "Emperor, you're naked," because they would lose their position and their research grants. So he found many flaws in Darwinian theory. The work of Cremo and Thomson is the most authentic. From an immense database of artifacts and fossil evidence, human history can be pushed back to several millions of years when humans coexisted with the dinosaurs, and Darwin's theory of man from apes lacks any proof of a transitional species. An evolutionary model is built up on a shifting evidence of academic opinion and a highly selective sampling of the evidence. All anomalous evidence is simply trashed and discarded. And he says, or they say, the existing evolutionary model must be jettisoned entirely. It can't be modified, it has to be chucked out completely and replaced by another model. In their book, they show a picture of this, which is a grooved metallic sphere from South Africa, found in the Precambrian deposits, which they date to about 2.8 billion years. Now just think of it, a grooved metallic sphere. Grooved metallic spheres don't exist in nature. Some sort of intelligence made this, and dating it to 2.8 billion years surely pushes back the age of man to far, far further beyond what current Darwinian evolution would have us believe. Of course, if you mention this to a conventional biologist, they'll come up with all sorts of ideas as to how you can get a metallic globule and how you can get grooves around it. Then when you tell them that the sphere was actually painted with henna, and henna does not occur naturally, it is a man-made dye, then they look at you and try to think of something else. So this is the problem we have, even with the most sincere, and I mean it, sincere scientists in the Theosophical Society. So by way of an occult commentary and elucidation, the central point to grasp is the hylozoic principle that there is absolutely nothing in the universe like dead matter. So from the minutest speck of dust, in whatever state it is, to the most gigantic galaxy, everything is conscious and awake, but awake to the degree of its evolutionary state. It is the degree of conscious awakening to life, not the fact of life, that is so important to grasp. And hence we have the saying, I slept in the stone and I stirred in the vegetable and I dreamt in the animal and I woke in the plant, in the man. The I, as the sleeper, stirrer, dreamer, awakener, is the one self-same consciousness in different modes of operation, working through progressively more complex vehicles of manifestation. So, occult science regards every atom as an independent entity and every cell as a conscious unit that can display the outward characteristics of mechanical billiard ball theory, but each cell, like its component particles, is not merely physical, but a psycho-spiritual unit acting under law that pertains also to the psycho-spiritual realms. So these are the simple and profound maxims upon which occult science builds the whole evolutionary edifice that has brought forth all life from below the mineral to beyond the state of ordinary humanity. And we show, as we will in the next talk, that evolution does not just occur from a common lineage, but man is of polygenetic origin, meaning that, before that, by way of a summary, the principle, occult commentary and elucidation, the principle of hylozoism, that there's no such thing as dead matter, all is conscious, and every atom and cell is a conscious unit. Now, occult anthropogenesis affirms that man is of polygenetic origin, meaning that new types or species of mankind have originated from more than one ancestral species, and there was a variety of modes of procreation before humanity fell into the ordinary, the now accepted sexual method of generation. And most staggering of all, the evolution of animals, of the mammals at any rate, follows from that of man instead of preceding it. And the third postulate is possibly that one, the evolution of animals, is the most difficult and the hardest to accept. Western science believes evolution to be a bottom-up process, from matter to mind. Occult science affirms that consciousness is primal, therefore evolution is top-down and back again. In other words, it is cyclical, involving both involution and evolution. The third postulate, as I say, is the most difficult to accept because man is of divine origin, which is diametrically opposed to the now generally accepted theories of evolution. But the seminal researches of Cremo and Thompson and Richard Milton are eroding this flawed viewpoint, and indeed their latest book is called Human Devolution. But we always must distinguish between the materialistic, powerful, Nobel Prize-seeking, research grant-grabbing scientist and the mystical, humble, true scientist. And I'm not going to call this all out, but you have the mystic pronouncements of great scientists, Albert Einstein, that science cannot solve the ultimate mystery of nature, Max Planck, science also demands the believing spirit, Heisenberg, I did not know this before, physics is of no importance, the world is illusion. Well, if the scientists at CERN, fiddling with their Large Hadron Collider costing 10 billion or whatever, would take on board Heisenberg's wisdom, they might think again. about trying to reproduce the origin of the universe. And then Schrödinger, the scientific worldview contains no ethical values. Prince Louis de Broglie, our souls have not grown in proportion to our bodies. And Wolfgang Pauli, who said we have to embrace both the rational and the mystical viewpoint. And all of these scientists are Nobel laureates. And we can add Sir Arthur Addington and Sir James Jeans, where mind no longer appears as an accidental intruder, but as the creator and governor of the realm of matter, which is precisely why mathematics, which is a purely mental subject, can be used to model the universe, which is pure consciousness and therefore mental in essence. So finally then, I will call this out, Blavatsky, saying nature is always deceitful on the physical plane. And now that they have studied the length and breadth of the skeleton of man, his physical body, it is high time they, the scientists, strain their necks and eyes to gaze beyond. Because all of science's wonderful discoveries will be like headless chickens unless they, the scientists, will unite the body with its informing soul. In other words, blend physics with metaphysics. There is no injunction ever in occult science by Blavatsky or anyone else of rejecting science. She is asking us to blend materialistic science with esoteric science, to blend physics with metaphysics, to blend the body with its informing soul. Otherwise, nature will always be deceitful on the physical plane, as I'm sure the scientists at CERN are finding out. Our last slide is, can we doubt, remembering that many more individuals are born than can possibly survive? This is Darwin's exposition on natural selection. But then if you put on what Newton says, that such a wonderful uniformity in the planetary system must be allowed the effect of choice. And then he says, and does it not appear from phenomena that there is a being incorporeal, living, intelligent, omnipresent? And then we might now add something concerning a certain most subtle spirit which pervades and lies hid in all gross bodies, by the force and action of which spirit the members of animal bodies move at the command of the will. And Michael Gomes asked us to reflect on the Emerald Tablet, and it really alludes, if you read it, to this subtle spirit that lies hid. I like Old English, instead of hidden, lies hid in every pore and every subtle fissure and crack and crevice of all bodies, and by its action the motion, the will and an intelligence is determined. But these are things that cannot be explained in a few words, says Newton. But Blavatsky did attempt when she said occultism does not deny the certainty of the mechanical origin, it only claims the absolute necessity of mechanics. And my favourite one, mortal physical man is the musical instrument, and the immortal ego, the performing artist. And the potentiality of sound, of course, lies in the instrument, because the greatest Paganini could not evoke beautiful sounds from a cheap and useless violin. And that depends entirely on the fidelity of transmission, she says, from to the objective plane of the unspoken divine thought in the very depths of man's subjective nature. But all of this is entirely the result of our friend karma. And physical man may, to follow our simile, be a priceless Stradivarius or a cheap and cracked fiddle, or gain a mediocrity between the two, in the hands of the Paganini that ensouls him,